Welcome to today's podcast, brought to you by WJHS Podcasting Incorporated. This is Fire the Dog in the Cave podcast, brought to you by Jason Priestley, Al Casiello, and Michael Clark.
All right, welcome to the Fire the Dog in the Cave podcast. Today is March 17th. It's primary election day in Illinois.
St. Patrick's Day, too.
St. Patrick's Day as well. It's the day the Democratic Party and the Republican Party select their candidates for the general election in November. I'm here today with 8th grade teacher, Mr. Prisney. How are you today?
Doing well. Thanks for inviting me and having me.
We're also here with Mr. Clark. How are you today, Mr. Clark?
Good. How are you doing, Mr. Casiello?
I'm doing great.
Excellent.
So it's election day today. Have you voted yet, Mr. Prisney?
I did. In fact, I took the opportunity to exercise my right to vote, and I actually did that early.
Early
Yeah.
voting, so you can go into a place early.
Right? They open up polls several weeks prior to the actual election day, and anyone that wants to may vote early, and they do that for a variety of reasons: to beat the lines, if they have a conflict on election day.
How about you, Mr. Clark? Did you vote yet?
I have actually. I did mine a little bit differently. I actually sent mine in via mail, which is, a little bit different than you would typically expect, but it's another option, and it worked for me. Got to be home with the family, got to be home with the kid.
Do our listeners know what the mail is?
I don't know. Sometimes we're used to that social media business. We don't sending things electronically. No, I was able to write it down and send it all away.
Very nice. I'm going to go in today, and I'm going to vote live. When you go in live, you're asked what party you would like to vote for, because this is a primary election. So I can ask for the primary ballot of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. Today we're going to discuss what the purpose of the primary election is. It's happening today. We're going to figure out the history of electing a president. And we're going to make our best predictions on what will happen this November in the general election.
We'll also share with you the history of democracy and kind of walk you through the path of how to become president of the United States, requirements to become a candidate, primary versus a caucus, what the national convention timeline looks like, and then to the general election and a little bit about the Electoral College.
How many presidential elections have there been?
That's a great question. This will be the 59th presidential election this year. Should President Trump be reelected, he'll stay the 45th president of the United States. Whereas if another candidate wins the presidency, we will be on to our 46th different president. Well, it's interesting when people talk about or are learning about what it takes to become the president of the United States. Oftentimes they'll say things like, oh, he or she must have to have a pretty significant experience in the political arena, when in fact, that's not true at all. Mr. Casiello, what does the Constitution actually say about requirements to become a presidential candidate?
There's only three things you need. You need to be at least 35 years old, a natural born citizen of the United States, which usually means you're born in the United States, and you have to be a resident for at least 14 years.
That's it. That's all it says. Now, some interesting facts about presidents when we talk about, this idea of having to be at least 35. That's actually relatively young, considering the age of most politicians. But some interesting facts are, Mr. Casiello, who's the youngest president to ever serve at the time they were sworn in?
Teddy Roosevelt was the youngest. He was only 42 years old. And President Trump is the oldest president who was ever sworn into office at the age of 70 years old.
Okay, so Mr. President, I have a question. I've been hearing about all these different guys, Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, heard about a bunch of other ones, but I was curious. Can you tell me what is a primary? What am I looking for?
So it's great that we have so many people that want to be involved in our democracy and in our elections. So lots of different people have plans and ideas and want to become president, and they all have their individual ideas about how government should work. When we look at the political spectrum, we have liberals on the left-hand side of the spectrum, and we have Republicans or conservatives on the right hand of the spectrum, and everywhere in between. But ultimately, they have similar ideas, and they belong to their respective political parties. And then this is where the primaries and the caucuses come in. Candidates from each party travel all over the country. There's debating, there's ads on the radio and the internet and television, and they're trying to win the favor of their particular party members, or try to sway people that might not be sure exactly who they may be voting for. There are some technicalities in between a caucus and a primary, so I'll turn it over to Mr. Casiello to explain the difference between the two.
Okay, so all 50 states are going to select delegates to presidential conventions that'll happen over the summer. So states either have primaries or caucuses to select their delegates. Illinois is going to have a primary. We're having a primary today where candidates are selecting their delegates who are going to go to a convention and select their candidate for president. So in Illinois, the Democratic Party is choosing between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden and what delegates they want to go to this convention. And the Republican Party is choosing delegates to go to the convention for Donald Trump. And those delegates will select the candidate over the summer who will be in the general election in November. Some states do caucuses to pick delegates, which are kind of like political meetings that a small group of people go to choose who the delegates are going to be. But more and more states are doing primaries to select the delegates to the national conventions that are going to happen over the summer.
So, Mr. Casiello, you mentioned a national convention. When I was wondering, Mr. Prisny, enlighten me a little bit. What happens at a national convention?
So in the summer, as Mr. Casiello talked about, the Democrats are going to hold their national convention in July in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, whereas the Republicans will have theirs about a month later in August, and that'll be held in Charlotte, North Carolina. And it's a lot of pomp and circumstance and celebration and inspirational speakers from both political parties, but ultimately one candidate from each party is going to be sort of forwarded on or catapulted onto the stage, almost literally. And then this is where we're going to the final presidential nominee, as well as the vice presidential nominee or their running mate.
Okay, and this is where the political parties say what they stand for, and if they're elected, what they're going to do, and how they hope to lead the country. Very nice.
So, Mr. Casiello, can you talk us through a little bit about what's going to occur shortly after these national conventions? What is the general election process going to look like for our country?
So after the national conventions, when the political parties pick their candidate, then there will be the campaign up until the election. The election happens this year on November 3rd. It's the Tuesday after the first Monday in November 3rd this year. And those candidates will campaign and say what their vision is for the country, and they'll try to convince the voters to vote for them. And then on November 3rd, the country will go vote, and we will see if there's a new president or if President Trump is reelected. And the two main candidates will be the Democratic candidate and the Republican candidate, who at this time seem like the Republican candidate will be Donald Trump, and the Democratic candidate is really down to two candidates, Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. Joe Biden is the former vice president. Bernie Sanders is the senator from the state of Vermont. So the Democrats are going to select their candidate who will go against the Republican candidate.
So when people cast their vote, they're actually voting for a group of people known as electors, and there's this. It can be a kind of a convoluted situation. This thing known as the electoral college, which we will get to and explain. But I think before we get into that, let's turn back the clock. And Mr. Clark, if you could shed some light for our listeners about this idea of democracy and giving power back to the people and having choice.
Sure, absolutely. Choice. I love the fact that you use that word. Back during the time, roughly 500 BC, looking at ancient Greece, Athens to be more specific, this idea, they had tribes, essentially, these tribes of people. They didn't want to elect one single leader. They were looking for more of exactly that choice, this idea of whole decision. And the fact that they were looking at it, this idea, again, we're talking about choice of talking it through and figuring out and essentially voting. Something unique to keep in mind that when they talk about voting, they have stones to cast their vote for their choice. One specific one talking about how they would vote on whether or not they should go to battle or go to wars and those kinds of things, which is such a big, important thing. Whereas we look now, looking at leading up past all of that, the choice that they're talking about, the 500s. After that, you're looking at really a whole lot of just solely monarchies and rulers and kings that made the decisions for the people. Not only until you get back to us now today, where we have this electoral college and selecting and voting for people, which really is unprecedented because it's such a major change, especially for the United States. So voting and change, it's unreal.
So, Mr. Clark, you're describing democracy and how people had the choice to vote with rocks. They would put their black rocks or their white rocks in the bins to vote. Could anybody vote?
Actually, no. Back then, the only people that were allowed to vote were the citizens. And give me a little background on what a citizen was. A citizen was a male over the age of 18. A little bit different than what we have now today.
Probably landowners as well.
Absolutely. You had to own land. You had to be a part of the society, being a citizen. 18-year-old male that owned that land.
So one of the big ideas with our Constitution in the United States is people were able to elect their president. Do we have a perfect democracy, or people able to elect the president directly, or how does that work, Mr. Prisney?
I don't know that I would use the word perfect, but it's a system that's been in place for many years. Over time in the United States, people have had to gain the right to vote, also referred to as suffrage. Different groups, it wasn't, going back to what Mr. Clark talked about, it always wasn't a fair representation of society. We're in a better place now. We use something called the Electoral College, and each state gets a certain number of electors. I think we're going to be able to put up a map or a visual for students to look at here. But basically, there's a total of 538 votes, electoral votes, that are at stake. So a simple majority, if you cut that in half, is 270. So essentially, the presidential election is a race to 270 electoral votes. Whoever wins would then take the oath of office and is inaugurated in January. Again, the election is in early November, and then he or she, this year it looks like it's going to be a he, sworn in January and take the oath of office.
All right, very good. It looks like we're coming to the end of this. Hopefully you've learned a little bit about what the primary election is, how we're selecting a president, a little bit of the history of democracy, and we hope you've enjoyed The Fire, the Dog in the Cave.
Oh!